Hello, welcome to the penultimate Cold War lesson.
Lesson 16, Gorbachev and Reagan, the beginning of the end of the Cold War.
Fantastic. And we're going to look at these two chaps and how their relationship together ended up helping the world towards a resolution of the Cold War and the end of Russia or the USSR. So,
who's Reagan? So just to recap, he's a staunch anti-communist. He wants to and has expanded U.S. military spending exponentially, and he's really assertive against the USSR. And his plan is to beat them both militarily, if necessary, but more acutely economically by increasing spending that he knows the Russians will have to match. After 1984, following complaints mostly from a lot of his NATO allies, because they started to worry and actually really genuinely fear that his sort of saber-rattling brinksmanship and the nature of his aggressive stance against the Soviet Union actually could bring people closer to war, he starts to back down. There's a little bit of political dissatisfaction at home as well, and he changes his tone to emphasize negotiation. He'll keep spending high and keep the pressure on, but he'll start to look for, by the middle of the 1980s, perhaps a negotiated solution to ending the Cold War.
now if he was up against someone like Stalin or Khrushchev, like Reagan's not going to negotiate. He's someone who will negotiate, but he's not going to he's going to need a lot of contrition. He's going to need someone to give in. And by those beautiful turns in history, this change in 1984 comes at a time where we have a new leader in charge, the 54-year-old Gorbachev.
Mikhail
Gorbachev. In fact, my brother's middle name is Mikhail Gorbachev. P.O. Mikhail Gorbachev's Suter.
My brother's name's Pat.
You can tell the age in which my brother was raised. In fact, my parents call me Mania. Anyway, he is a reformer. He is different to everyone else. He is seen as a young, new broom, as he's someone who will come in and get rid of all the old fusty problems, all the old corrupt officials, and actually deal with it in a new way. Gorbachev is a man who will make a deal. Gorbachev is a man with a mission. Gorbachev is a reformist. He is not a capitalist. He loves communism. Even when communism in the USSR falls, he loves it. But he believes, much like Dubček and Nagy, that for communism to survive, it needs to reform. It needs to change politically to make people hate it and see it as less oppressive. And it needs to change economically so that it actually works. And Gorbachev is not an accident. He comes at a time after 3 or 4 separate leaders have failed to deal with the fundamental economic problems of Russia, which are getting worse. And if there was not this crisis, the Politburo would not have appointed this outsider, this reformist, to deal with it. But because the crisis is so great, in part caused by the economic circumstances caused by Reagan, they take a bet, they take a gamble on Gorbachev and they put it in. Gorbachev sees the USSR even, as stagnant, as economically falling behind the West in terms of quality of life and consumer goods. And that this is in part due to the great amount of spending caused by the Cold War. He is concerned that if this situation continues, the generation who remembers Stalin is dying. And now we've got a generation which is even the generation after the generation that remembers Stalin. They will not stay in line. And he's worried that there's essentially two choices when these guys start to rebel. We either go back to Stalin this way and we shoot people on the streets, which is risky, or we have to give in and we end communism. His big thing, therefore, before it gets to that extreme, if we reform communism, hopefully end the Cold War to make it to help this economic stress that the country's on, we can save communism. Okay, so he is also slightly concerned that the evidence from Czechoslovakia and Poland with solidarity is that the regimes in Eastern Europe are becoming less popular as they are seen as too much controlled by Russia. And he worries that if people start to fear that Russia is controlling them and not acting in their interest, they'll become more revolutionary. And then it will be in the same situation whereby what happens? People rebel. And Russia has two choices. We either let them rebel or we crush them brutally. And they're decisions that Gorbachev doesn't want to make. So his big thing, if we can reform now, we will save ourselves from the need for revolution and fighting later. So, what's Gorbachev overweight? He wants to save communism. He wants to reform the system politically and economically. But in order to do so, he's going to need to change the Cold War. And therefore, he doesn't really care about what he gives in terms of superpower status and arms race. For him, it's more important that Russia stays communist and stays free and makes people happy, then they have a bajillion nuclear bombs and they can kill USA. And this will explain a lot of the sudden increase in friendly relations between West and East, because Reagan has just had his mind changed. He wants to negotiate, and now there's a man who doesn't massively care about the Cold War at all.
So what are his two policies, or sorry, what types of things does he put forward? He does two policies that would go down in history for their importance in terms of achieving his goals. And the first one is Glasnost, and the Russian word Glasnost means openness. What that means is, instead of sort of the top-down system of the Soviet era, the way Stalin used to run things, there would be openness. He would go out across and spread out across Russia, conducting a number of town hall meetings. He would visit people at their place of work. He would ask them their opinions on things.
He'll make jokes. He'll mock the managers of the workers.
He famously stops for tea at somebody's house on the spur of a moment, just to gauge their opinion. And he wanted to get sort of people's sort of input into what they would like to see happen. Moreover, he goes and starts to, I guess, send signals that the repressive measures that had kept the communist countries in line will be eased. He releases political prisoners, banned works and books and things like that had been banned throughout the communist era were not allowed to be published. Censorship was relaxed. He allowed increased foreign travel. For the first time, Russians could go over to North America and compete in sporting events that weren't the Olympic Games, for instance. That people were allowed to travel outside of the Soviet bloc.
And see life in the West, which will be a problem in due course.
Yeah, that's a very, very good point. And he also opens up local elections, so people are allowed to vote for their local mayor and so on and so forth.
Not the national at this point, but local elections. So this is political. Glasnost is the political change. The economic change is Perestroika, which basically means restructuring. And his argument was that the economy had become stagnant because everything was under complete control of the government. So therefore, you got your job as manager of a factory, not necessarily because you were good, but because you knew a guy who knew a guy who got you the job. And you got a job in your factory because you knew a guy who knew a guy who knew a guy who got you a job. And this means there's no incentive to work hard. But also, there's nothing, the only people who tell you what to make are some bureaucrats and people working in Moscow. That means that they're going to say, "I'll build this radio." There's going to be no incentive, no reason to make that radio different, make that radio well, because you're getting paid the same by the government. What's the point? So why would I make a good radio if I know I'm getting paid the same for it? I might as well make it quickly, make it badly, and then I can go home and I can have some lunch. That's perfect. So what he decides to do is reduce the central control of industry. He allows people to set their own production of goods. And in 1988, he goes even further, where he makes a law on cooperatives, which allows people to make their own private businesses. This is the first time this has happened since the NEP, which you remember from the Russia course. This is huge, because essentially he's saying the private market, people going, "I'm going to make a better radio than that person's radio, people will buy it more, and I will make loads of money." That's semi-capitalist. It's within a communist system, it's going to be heavily taxed. But as part of this restructuring, the whole old-fashioned top-down, we will organize and set targets, is being ended. It's an admission by Gorbachev that this model is essentially a failure. And also, he tried to increase to free up those who could control trade from this trade. Anyone could therefore go and get access to trade with foreign goods. They can import foreign goods and they can export foreign goods. And finally, he reduces the army unilaterally, that means without asking anyone, by 500,000 men in 1988 alone, as well as many cuts of cutting the bureaucracy, the people who had jobs, very often doing nothing in the local state areas of the economy. So what we see in Perestroika is a massive shift towards a semi-capitalism. It's not fully capitalist, more capitalist, less state control, more private market orientated with a smaller state system.
So what's his vision? He wanted to keep communism, as was said, but he recognized the old system was out of date, and it basically couldn't continue to survive. So he wanted to increase in the amount of communication with the West, open Russia up to the West, to sort of change the conceptions in many ways, as he would famously say, that the Russians had on the West, that had really held them back.
Actually, if we're friends, I don't need a massive army.
Yeah.
It can save me army.
And therefore reduce military spending, relieve the pressure on the Soviet economy, et cetera, et cetera. He would put increased emphasis on the things that people like, the things that have really been limited: consumer goods, trade, services, things that, famously people had to wait for. You need a microwave, 5-year wait. He wanted to make these things available to increase the living standard and happiness of the people.
And therefore support communism.
Yeah, and to do that, he had to actually embrace the market. So instead of more of a controlled economy, he had to be sort of, a command economy, he had to be more of a controlled economy. And what that means is effectively, instead of everything being set from the Soviet Union and being controlled tightly, he would allow a little bit of the forces of the free market to come back into play. And he basically allowed people to feel less oppressed by communism, reduce terror, and having a friendlier, more equal relationship with the Eastern Bloc.
So, what we see, therefore, is a communist system which eases up the sort of relationships between it, both with its own people, but with the other countries. And now we are going to see a series of different meetings which happen in quick succession where both sides in relationship increase. So the first one they meet at, first meeting between East and West is at Geneva in 1985.
Yeah, November 1985. Reagan wouldn't give up his commitment to Star Wars in this one, but a friendlier tone is very much established. Both of Gorbachev and Reagan would speak at the end of this that the world, because of the way they were approaching each other, was becoming a safer place. They also broke with convention and met without advisors, and they discussed issues on their own, which is something that hadn't been done before. Though nothing concrete was decided, they came up with what was known as the Geneva Accord, and this committed the two countries to a couple things. Number one, they'd speed up arms talks. Number two, they'd work towards the abolition of chemical weapons, getting rid of like mustard gas, chlorine gas as weapons of warfare. And I suppose number three, I should say, is to be more active on issues of human rights, which is an important concession, because that was something, of course, that President Carter, Reagan's predecessor, had criticized the Soviets for.
Absolutely right. And I think it's really important to realize that this is a first step, but it signals goodwill.
Yeah.
And that leads very quickly onto Reykjavik.
And they had, one of the things they said is that we'll meet again soon to further these talks.
Absolutely right. And at Reykjavik, we see it even more. Gorbachev at this point says, I'm willing to get rid of all ballistic missiles. All nuclear missiles which get fired, we can get rid of. Which is a bold statement. Reagan's like, oh, I love it, yeah, let's do it. But what about SDI? And suddenly this becomes a real issue. Because Gorbachev says, no, you need to, well, why would you need SDI if I'm getting rid of all ballistic missiles? Why are you doing that? And then Reagan refuses to, because that's his big project. He spent lots of money in it, and also like he doesn't quite trust Russians to get rid of all the ballistic missiles. Why would you get rid of your safety thing before you can? So essentially, that initial deal breaks down. However, the fact that Gorbachev was so willing to get rid of pretty much all his missiles, or ballistic missiles, which aren't all missiles, but like a significant chunk of them, shows Reagan that Gorbachev is serious, and actually helps Reagan trust. Reagan very rarely didn't really trust Gorbachev. He thought it was another communist functionary, but he really started to trust in Gorbachev and agrees very quickly that we need to have new meetings. The failure of Reykjavik made Gorbachev, ironically, even more willing to accept basic terms which do not help Russia. The zero option, the idea of getting rid of nuclear missiles, it made him more willing to accept cuts to nuclear missiles, even though it would benefit the US. Because remember, Gorbachev hasn't got an eye on winning the Cold War. Gorbachev's eye on just surviving and making Russia great. And so this initial failure meant next time maybe I should compromise even more.
Right. But the big thing, Reykjavik wasn't a success because Reagan refused to drop the Strategic Defense Initiative, Star Wars, SDI.
But it doesn't destroy relations.
No, it doesn't. But basically he said that Reagan's refusal to get rid of STI frustrated and scuttled the opportunity for an agreement of any consequence to be met.
Actually, but as we shall see, the goodwill that continues from this becomes the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty.
Yeah, so this was a treaty that was signed in December 1987, and this is quite interesting. Basically, it said that the United States and the Soviet Union would remove nuclear and non-nuclear missiles within ranges between 500 and 5,500 kilometers. So what does that mean? That means that 1,846 Soviet missiles and 846 US missiles closely observed by the other side, which allows unusual levels of access to top secret locations. So it's basically saying that here's where we are, you can have a look, we will ensure that we keep up with these goals. This is a really, a huge first step.
Essentially, here's my secret silo in Siberia. You know where it is now. have a look at me destroy it. And if you have a look at the ratios there, Soviets are losing many more missiles than the US.
Yeah, so this really is a sort of a stringent verification process is really the most important thing. The fact that they'll be able to look in really, really closely on what each other was doing. Reagan describes the INF, in fact, as a realization of an impossible vision. And Gorbachev stated that it had universal significance for mankind, meaning that they were really willing to let each other, I guess, into each other's business in a way that never happened before.
And this is so much bigger than SALT 1, and this is seen as an unprecedented change, a huge reduction in the amount of weapons. And although there's much more to go, it's seen as a fantastically positive first step. And therefore, Gorbachev's popularity in terms of the West, not so much the East, although amongst the young in Russia, so much, a little bit more, goes up massively. There's this thing called Gorby mania, which we'll talk about in a second, where he becomes very quickly a massively popular individual. These positive relations only develop in 1988. Reagan takes a trip to Moscow where they wander around together the sort of Red Square. Admittedly, a lot of the people there are actually KGB men and their sons, posing as sightseers, but still, the thought's there, and they willingly discuss life in the Soviet Union. And there is, in the picture at the bottom, which I really like, there's the Cold War warrior Reagan still speaking in the Moscow State University, in front of a bust of Lenin and this hammer and sickle, saying nice things about Russia and Gorbachev. This shows he, even in this speech, backtracks and says, I don't mean the evil empire thing I said at the start. This is a real change. It shows a real thawing of relations.
One interesting point to consider, and something that's came up in an exam a couple of years ago, is that at the same time, though those two leaders are starting to get along, what you need to understand is behind the scenes, the wives of Ronald Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev also famously got along. And in many ways, the wives played a role in pushing the two leaders together. As a result, you can say that there's sort of a soft power being sort of exercised on these two leaders by their wives, who got on very famously.
That's right. And what this didn't come to any sort of official agreement, but what it really does is shows a message. The image of the President of the United States and the party secretary, general secretary of this communist empire, arm in arm in the Red Square, really shows that this is a new era of Cold War relations, one which isn't based on conflict and suspicion, one that's been built on mutuality and mutually beneficial ending of tensions. So, what are the effects of this internationally? Well, let's be honest, most of this progress is Gorbachev willingly giving in a lot and gaining a little. Okay, Gorbachev takes a lot of attacks within his own party, not his one party, for surrendering. A lot of these deals are unfair, unhelpful towards Russia. But if you remember, Gorbachev's game is not to win the Cold War; it's to reduce tensions. And his whole thing is the only way he's going to get it quickly, which is what he wants, is by saying, "Here's a really great deal, Reagan. Why don't you take it?" And we go, "Oh, thank you very much." So Gorbachev is the one, or for all that Reagan wants to negotiate, is the one who's doing most of the running. However, once Reagan is convinced by Gorbachev's sincerity, he does very quickly get over his hatred of communism, and actually he really hates communists. And like he genuinely creates a working relationship with Gorbachev, and so that's very important, because to get over one's like hostilities for a particular ideal, for the interest of greater peace, is essential, because Reagan at any point could just be a real stroppy individual and just demand more and be a real meanie about it. But he isn't. And so what do we see overall in this period? A massive easing of tensions and a cooperative atmosphere with rapid changes politically and economically between the two countries. And a massive popularity of Gorbachev, which is sometimes dubbed Gorby mania in the West, because they finally see a good guy in the story. They're used to these faceless, bad, awful bureaucrats controlling and manipulating from afar, but now they've got a guy they like. And this is a new era of positivity. This is a new era of things have changed. Our parents lived in an era of fear, but we are now in an era of enlightenment, an era in new times where we don't have to worry about being nuked at any point in the day.
So, lastly, what are the effects on Russia? Obviously, they reduce their military presence in Eastern Europe, which will have, I guess, some consequences in allowing the Eastern Europeans to feel more secure as they vote with
Well, and more than that, it'll send a message. Like, if you take away your soldiers, you're kind of sending a message of like, we're not going to support those bad guys who are communists.
And those soldiers have been there since the end of World War II, and they played very key roles in establishing the Brezhnev Doctrine and keeping control in a lot of these states that necessarily did not want to toe the communist line that's dictated by Moscow.
Absolutely.
So it's a huge point. It really signals an end to the Brezhnev Doctrine, that they would use force to ensure the Warsaw Pact stays together. Of course, Glasnost, the idea of openness, creates political dissent acutely in countries like Poland, East Germany.
And not even in Russia, because as soon as you've got free speech or elements of free speech, and political criticism is released, and you haven't got as much censorship, you can criticize the government, and you can say, let's get even more reform. Although it's important to realize a lot of the attacks aren't on Gorbachev, it's on the system around him. Gorbachev is generally insulated from a lot of the attacks.
He's quite well liked, actually.
He's seen as a good man with good ideas. Then, but even people who aren't communists, he's seen as someone on our side.
And what you see really is when sort of the dam breaks, the Eastern Bloc is started inundated with modern material wealth from Western countries, and people start to like it. They start to like the freedoms. They start to see potentially that they could have at least the promise of a life as good as as the people in the West. And this has profoundly important effects in pushing people to sort of support the fall of the Soviet state.
And that's really important because actually, for as much as technology comes in, because of the end of censorship and the increased openness and increased foreign travel, you see how different it still is between East and West. And there's a lot to convince many Russians and many people in Eastern Bloc countries that communism has failed and capitalism is the way forward. That's what makes you have the real quality of life. And they have been insulated from that because of censorship, but now they can see it. And this does a lot to further push reform. This, without giving too much away, the next lesson's whole thing will be that the Russia comes to an end because these reforms that Gorbachev starts get out of control. And these are examples of how they get out of control. Because as soon as people are able to see the differences, they push for more reform. As soon as they're able to criticize the government, they will push for more reform. And finally, there are some changes economically, Perestroika, but to undo decades of stagnation takes more than a few years. And so it's not necessarily that easy to turn the economy around. So there are some signs there are improvements, but at this point, we are seeing people increasingly jealous, increasingly dissenting, increasingly getting away with it, but not the economic changes Gorbachev would have liked, which would have convinced them that actually communism works. So,
one more lesson left. We're almost at the end of the Cold War, but we see that between the two leaders, Gorbachev and Reagan, the steps to the beginning of the end of the Cold War are clearly laid, and we'll learn next lesson how the Cold War actually ends. But that's for another day, and that's not today. My name is Mr. Raine.
And this is Suter, exhausted.
Bye.
Bye.